In the last two episodes, we've covered how the Mannlicher 8890 wasn't all that great of a carbine action, and we skipped ahead to explain the Mannlicher 1895 long rifle. Today you'll see we've saved the best for last. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Repetier Carbine Model 1890, a gun that if you watched the last episode, you should already be a little bit familiar with, although this time we get to go to the light box. Weighing in at just over 7 pounds and at only 39 1/2 of an inch long, this is another one of those handy little shoulder arms we so love. It feeds from that one-directional 5-round end-block clip, chambering the 8x50mm rimmed cartridge. If you're just now tuning in, you are on episode 3 of 3, an ambitious project I must say, so you're probably going to be a little lost if you keep going. I dial it back to just to see where we're at, because there's a lot of history here. But just to recap, let's go over a few things. We covered the wedge-locking black powder 1886, the first of the Mannlicher rifles. Then we followed it through an evolution that eventually landed on the semi-smokeless 8890, which would still manage the later fully smokeless 8x50mm rimmed cartridge of 1893. Then we skipped ahead to the model 1895 infantry rifle, but what we barely touched was our 1890 carbine here today. Alright, so if you recall, that old 8890 wedge locker just wasn't standing up to the semi-smokeless and eventually smokeless cartridges, although the pure smokeless cartridge comes out just after this gun, so keep your order straight there, guys. Anyway, that's not the biggest problem though. The biggest problem is that long wedge locking action and very heavy wedge locking action means that it's very hard to adapt to a cavalry carbine. And so, they were having to use the old Verndl carbines well on into 1890, which is when we see this guy appear in response. So, they asked Mannlicher, what can you do for us to keep straight pull going? And he just has to reach back in time and dust off an old design. Just to recap, we have gone full circle because we started with a prototype 90-degree rotating straight pull bolt. We went to a wedge locker to simplify things, and when the black powder disappeared and the smokeless turned back up, we went right back to that rotating lock, although this time with the lugs at the front of the action. So, just to reiterate, this was targeted towards the cavalry, and so when the new action was trialed through 1889 and then adopted in December of 1890, the first thing we put together was one for the guys on horseback. Okay, a lot of this we heard from the last episode, so let's finally get a look at the 1890 action. Alright, once more, same as before, we have introduced that safety on the left side. Remember, this predates the 95, but again, should be very similar. Straight pull, very smooth. Unlike the 95, this has the old style 8890 style sights, still marked in Schritt, just like everything else. And if we wander up to the front, we're going to see we have no bayonet lug, no stacking rod. We're side slung only, set here at the wrist. And different again from that 95, we have a round cocking piece. This is the precursor, so obviously this was a bit too difficult. That's why they went with the big thumb pad. Loading and operation wise, no big difference. We're still using the 5-round 8x50mm clip. Although when this guy came out, this open side wasn't yet ready. This would have been solid like the old 1886. All right, you follow me so far, guys? Awesome. That's about it for now. I'm sorry these are so brief, but there's really no strong difference. Disassembly is the same, everything like that. If you saw the 1895 episode, you're already up to date. And if you saw the 8890 episode, you know how to read the markings. So there's not a big confusion point here, and it fits right in the middle, and honestly I wanted to keep the shorties together, so that's why this guy's coming so late. I'm sorry it feels awkward, but don't worry, the rest of this episode will make a lot more sense. Now, the animation isn't going to tell us anything new, so go back to the 1895 episode if you want to see more about how this gun is laid out. So, let's just skip right ahead and have Mae shoot this beautiful, beautiful weapon.
You guys should be pretty familiar with this loading process. Woo, smooth and light. Now, no surprises on that safety either. I like it. Blammo. You know, I think it's pretty good. Looks like a kite. Alright, back to Beardy.
You know, as sweet as this little honey is, Mae should thank me. Anyway, this guy would do fairly well, at least well enough initially that by December of 1891, there's already going to be another one introduced. This was the Extra Corps Gewehr M90. It was intended to arm the gendarmerie and the military police units. Now, this obviously seems similar to our cavalry carbine, but note the addition of a bayonet lug. This fits the same side mount bayonet as the 8890 rifle. This would be followed in 1894 by the Navy's Landing Force short rifle, which was basically the same but with an additional stacking rod. As with previous and later designs, these guys would be sold internationally, although not in huge numbers. You're going to see them go over to Bulgaria as usual. Man, Bulgaria got everything. And some over to Thailand, and interestingly enough, a few would go commercially through Belgian dealers. But for the most part, this is a good old Austro-Hungarian carbine. Now, these guys would perform really well. I mean, they're just the same as the M95 with some minor differences. Again, the sights and some shaping. So there's no real complaint here, and they're not obsolete at all. When we get around to 1914, there's going to be about 80,000 of these still in inventory, and nobody's going to turn their nose up at them. The only special consideration was the development and manufacture of an ersatz socket-style bayonet to fit the cavalry model during the war. Now, about this time, the Swiss had hit on the same problem as the dual monarchy, namely their straight pull action was also too long. The Schmidt-Rubin system was extremely smooth and reliable, but its notorious length gave the gun somewhat poor balance and prevented easy adaptation to the carbine. In hindsight, we know they'd just go ahead and force it into a short rifle, splitting the difference. But before that, they would try the Mannlicher 1890 locking system, in the form of this, the Model 1893, a licensed Swiss-produced copy. These use a Swiss-style magazine and charger loading system, chamber the 7.5mm M90 cartridge, and were honestly not well loved. Sorry, Mannlicher. Hopefully we'll get to review one in more detail someday, but for now, let's get back to Austria-Hungary. Despite the Swiss's opinion, this guy was doing great at home. Maybe they just didn't know how to make them right. Anyway, the problem is though, when you get to the 1895 long rifle trials, we're looking at some improvements, and those improvements require actual machine changes. Do we want to train up two different styles of manufacture, even though they're just slightly different? Or do we want to go ahead and wrap things up into one model? And with that in mind, they decided we'll retire the 1890 and we'll come up with a system of carbines and short rifles that work with the new 1895 action. And so you're going to see this, or something like it. This particular one happens to be the Repetier Karabiner Model 1895. And if that seems like a long name, we'll get into details in a moment. But first, Lightbox. Still, at an overall length of 39 1/2 inch, this gun is actually slightly lighter than the M90, coming in just under 7 pounds, even with the extras. It still uses the same 5-shot M-block clip, loading the same 8x50mm rimmed cartridge. Now, I'm gonna have to set this guy down because he's not the first of these things. As a matter of fact, he comes much later. Instead, during the rifle trials, they would already decide on the first pattern of shortened rifle. This would be the Repetier Stutzen 1895, which was designed to replace the previous Extra Corps and Navy models all at once. It featured underside sling swivels, a bayonet lug for the new M95 pattern bayonet, and a stacking rod. They would be officially adopted in September of 1897. Next up was the Repetier Karabiner, the cavalry version. As you can see, no bayonet lug or stacking rod. And it's slung on the left side so it can be carried on the back. These were introduced in January of 1899. They would later receive an update known as the Repetier Karabiner 1895 mit oberem Stützenring, which I'm sure I just really tore up. That translates roughly to, we put a bayonet lug on it because why not? This might have stemmed from a 1909 experiment with fitting folding bayonets for cavalry, like we saw with the Japanese Type 44 in Carcano Moshetto. Not many of these trial guns survive today. Alright, with both these models loosely defined, let's go ahead and take a look at what happened in between the 90 and the 95. So I'm going to try to lay these both out and take a closer look. I made it. Mostly. Okay. So, here's our 90. Here's our 95. And if I can get them both sort of in the same depth of field, I'll get my patented plastic pokey hand, and we'll go through some differences. One, obviously, the improved cocking piece. Two, we are going to see this big old bulky sight go for a nice little flat guy. Again, in Schritt, again, flip up. Although, they're not being so ambitious with that volley fire this time, guys. Look at that sucker. Full handguard has now been added to most of the models. All the models, actually, on these 95s. And then, don't pay too much attention to anything like sling swivel positions or things like that, because that's going to vary by the individual variants within their models. Although one thing that you can see, hopefully kind of clearly, and I can rotate these guys kind of carefully. And I'm sorry, it's a little over bright, but look how round this is. Just boop, nice dome. This is more flat top, giving a much slimmer, lower profile, which combined with that sight makes this a much more evenly laid gun. There's less snag, and there's less awkward rolling with the newer model. All right, with all that covered, let's go ahead and get this guy over to Mae for a demonstration.
If you don't have it down by now, I can't help you. Now, this particular gun had ejection problems. We found the culprit, and it was no big deal to fix, but we didn't have time to refilm. It does show, however, that this fairly wide open action is pretty easy to clear. Even startled the camera. Alright, let's slow it down. I definitely recommend a 6 o'clock hold. Back to Othais.
You know, a little behind the scenes on that. The first time we took this guy out to the range, it was so clean and so ready to go that we just went with it. And you know what? It had been duffel cut under the barrel band. That thing separated in a heartbeat, and then we had to go back and start all over again after making a little hidden repair. All right, anyway, those variants up to that point would all stay in inventory just like everything else. until 1914 when they were considered for replacement, just like that 1895 long rifle. So they were almost lost when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, with no reason whatsoever, and certainly not by agitating a number of people that were beneath you or by signing a bunch of weird interlocking treaties or any of that stuff, tune into the Great War, guys, because war were declared. And with that, OWG Steyr and FEG Budapest were both in a mad dash, cranked to 11 like I said last episode, to get these things out the door. They needed as many as possible. And there's sort of a logic problem, because if you look at what we had up to this point, there's basically two different models. We have an underslung and a side slung, and their roles are very different on the battlefield, and you don't want to mix them up. Well, that creates a logistics problem that you don't want to have. And a very simple solution is to just go ahead and make one universal short pattern rifle, call it a carbine, call it a Stutzen, whatever you want. That would mean that you could just issue it to anybody, and you'd have no worries and no tie-ups and no weird disjointed weights, and as you got equipment back, you could just reissue it where you want. It's a beautifully intelligent idea to universalize your short rifle. But that begs the question, which gun do you convert into the universal pattern? You know what? Fudge it. Let's change practically nothing and do both. Seriously, they put side slings on the Stutzen and underside slings on the carbine, and confusingly named them accordingly. So the only real way to tell them apart at a glance is the handguard length. Although I will say the Karabiner Stutzen has a fixed loop on that left side of the barrel band, whereas the Stutzen Karabiner, no confusion there guys, has a swiveling loop. You know, after sorting all that out, I know what our next Patreon goal is going to be. Whatever the amount I have to figure out, I'll do that later, but it's going to be tagged Get Othais Mental Help, because trying to sort out all those little variants from 60-year-old high-minded German text, which I've run through Google Translate at 2 in the morning, I probably need to check myself in for a week. Anyway, these guns would perform wonderfully compared to the long rifles. This is the same lesson that Italy learned, which is that a standard short rifle is fantastic when you have to fight your way through cramped trenches, or especially when you're talking about Austro-Hungary and Italy, getting up and down those mountainsides. So they both sort of hit on something that they really loved in these handy dandy carbines. In fact, demand would be so great for these little guys that in my notes I managed to find that there was at least some period, and I wish I could find how long. This is one of those things where we should probably just do like date surveys, so everybody keep an eye out for your Budapest long rifles and see what kind of dates you have, because apparently in 1916 at some point FEG was ordered, just focus on getting the short rifles out, we need them desperately. I'm sure that must have had a limit on it, but it's fascinating to see that there's a real priority switch to these beauties. As a matter of fact, FEG would specifically experiment on the Stutzen in the form of a shortened action that had been reduced by some 17 millimeters and place that bolt handle a bit further forward. It was hoped that this would provide a better bolt throw, encouraging easier rapid fire without losing the sight picture. They would also be fitted with the Bulgarian contract style gas bleed-off hole at the top of that bolt sleeve. I'm unsure of how many of these were ever created, but the examples I know of date from 1917. Roughly 700,000 combined Stutzens, carbines, whatever, would be produced from 1914 to 1918, making them a very important part of the war. Now, again, from our previous episode, we already know that Austria-Hungary breaks up, treaties, yada, yada, yada. One thing you might not know is that despite the fact that in the smaller military authorities, the tighter military authorities, especially in Italy and Austria-Hungary and a few other countries like Germany, have learned that the short rifle is extremely good. And as a matter of fact, having a universal short rifle and not having a long rifle isn't such a bad idea. The treaty signers, despite being, by the way, you got Britain and America, they should know better than this. They really consider the long rifle to be the military weapon. And so when they pass all these treaties and things, they're really banning the long rifles, and they're saying, no, you gotta get rid of them. You only have so many long rifles. Oh, you can have a ton of these short rifles and carbines though, because those are just police weapons. We're not that worried about them. It's so backwards, it's hilarious, because this is exactly what they wanted to keep, and this is what they were allowed to keep, and so they did. Also in our last episode, we covered the adoption of the 8x56mm Spitzer cartridge, the true powerhouse that would take full advantage of this locking action strength. Go back to that if you really want details on it, guys, because all I want to say is that with the introduction of those arms, and by the way, these guys were converted, all of them, and as they were converted, they were usually converted over to a pure side-slung pattern, so almost all the original carbines and Stutzens would turn into bayonet lug having, stacking rod having, side-slung only guns. And there's a few exceptions out there, but not that many. The other thing it did, though, is it introduced an entirely new Stutzen, one made from the long rifle. You see, the universal short rifle concept had finally caught on, and these long rifles just weren't so useful anymore. So while they were being pulled apart for rechambering, why not go further and chop them down into short rifles? So the barrels and stocks were cut, new front sights were pressed on, and rear sights were remarked. As a matter of fact, let me get this guy out of the way very carefully. There we go. As a matter of fact, I happen to have one of those converted little Stutzens right here, as do a lot of collectors in the US. These things are everywhere. Now, if I take it with an original and put them side by side, we can see some differences. So, whoop, there. So, first things first, just so you know, this guy is a pre-war Bulgarian long rifle that managed to get converted down. He's been better hand fit than most, but we'll talk about that in a second. You'll see right away that our big difference is going to be the short old Stutzen or carbine sight versus the remodified, ground and remarked long rifle sight. It's huge. But another thing that stands out if we get further down, whoop, are the barrels. Now, I can't do this and point at the same time, so take a look at one barrel and then the other. One has its front sight fitted right to the barrel. The other, you can see that ring, that's from where it was pressed down over the barrel. All right, so the one with the press on, that's our former long rifle. This is our original carbine or Stutzen. All right, rock these guys back forward. Otherwise, not a huge difference, but these conversion processes, the rechambering specifically, they added a lot to that thing of how stiff these guys are. And I've talked about this before, but the converted rifles are just much heavier than the unconverted rifles. And even that being said, this is a very nice converted rifle. I hand selected it to be my 95-30, not thinking about the fact that some years later I would need to have a really cruddy one for the show. I found just through personal observation, if I can get the patented plastic pokey hand back out, if you have a Bulgarian one specifically, and when it was redone, the serial was kept up here on the handle, they tend to be smoother than the ones that were electro-penciled on the backside here. So, keep an eye out if you want a good shooter. All right, as we covered very well in the last episode, these guys and some long rifles would remain in inventory for a number of countries, Austria, Hungary, and we're going to see them out of Bulgaria. Now, by the way, each of those countries is going to play different games with their front sights. We're not focused on the 30 patterns in this episode, so if you're curious about any sort of attachments up here on your gun, check some forums, do some research, or wait until we get time for another episode. But these guys would serve all the way again through World War II in fairly significant numbers, which makes them back-to-back World War losers, actually. I'm sorry to say they were on the losing side both times, it appears. But it doesn't mean that they're terrible guns. They're just danged unlucky. Wrapping this up, let's talk more about Ferdinand Mannlicher. He would be knighted by Emperor Franz Josef in 1892, and again in Germany in 1899. Greece, Spain, and Portugal would all give him high honors as well for his arms development. Conveniently, they were customers of Steyr. Despite his genius and incredibly widespread of small arms innovations, Mannlicher always seems to trail fairly far behind Mauser and Browning in terms of popular history. On a personal note, I have a 3-point theory as to why Mannlicher is underappreciated today. 1, he was not a salesman. He was a sort of keep-to-yourself sort of person. He did his job, he went home. He left the marketing up to OWG Steyr. Number 2, he was a fervent patriot of a long-lost empire now. He would pass away before it fell, but once it fell, it took his name with it. I mean, ultimately, what you're going to see is that you end up with these themes on guns, these feelings towards guns that stem from national pride. A lot of you in the US will recognize this because we're all very familiar with M1 carbines and Garens, and a lot of you might not have even known a lot about these guys because those are part of our national identity. Well, when the nation falls apart, you don't always keep that identity. As a matter of fact, there might be a lot of resentment back towards the old empire. Now, a lot of people today can look at their own history and see how these guns played a role, and they're getting more and more popular as we get deeper into that history, and that's a wonderful thing because Mannlicher's name is going to re-flourish. Now, on the third point, he might not be all that appreciated because, well, a lot of what he invented went unseen. Now, unlike, especially like Browning, okay, Browning invented a lot. He invented very widely. And then he developed what he invented. And he was smart enough to spread that out over multiple companies. He would walk around and just sell it to everybody so that FN produced this and Remington produced that. And, you know, Winchester, all over the place. I mean, practically everybody produced some sort of Browning design because he would just shove and shove and shove until somebody bought. And that means that all of his ideas saw some level of production. And he would run them all into the ground. Mannlicher would throw a bunch of stuff at the wall, all of it really innovative, and see what stuck and then develop it. So he wouldn't fix and perfect every one of his systems. And in that regard, a lot of his patents and things like that, just we don't see them in a physical form. And so it's hard to appreciate his, you know, wide design aspects or the genius of those aspects. But look at the episodes we covered in the past couple where we talked about the fact that he already knew that detachable magazines would be a good idea. He had already invented the proper straight pull before they made him dumb it down. And then by doing that, he went to a totally different design. This is a truly genius man, and I certainly appreciate him. All right, with all that praise aside, let's go ahead and get Mae's opinion on, well, specifically the 90 and the 95 from World War I. We are not going to be talking about the 95-30 just yet. All right, once again, we've made room for Mae, and we've made room for 2 of these little carts. Would you put that thing away? I'm going to sell it.
No!
Get your carbine out.
Come on, don't be a jerk.
That's 2 episodes ago. Anyway.
Yeah.
All right, so we have 2 of these easily fit in screen carbines. Well, technically mine's a Stutzen. All right, so let's get Mae's opinion on both of these little darlings. And starting, I guess, with the ergonomics.
All right, so first things first, this thing is short. It actually all shows on camera. You can definitely tell just how tiny this thing is. It doesn't have much weight to it, which is fantastic. Now, it is thinner than the 8890, but it is thicker than the 95, so it's somewhere in the mid-range of being pretty decent. There's not a lot of mess going up here up top with a stacking hook or anything like that, so it's definitely helped reduce some of the weight. Now, it is missing the handguard up top, which I do miss because I don't like grabbing a hot barrel, but that could just be a preference thing on my end. The sights aren't flush anymore. Come on, guys, I kind of miss that. Now, it still does have this, like, thin pistol grip. However, there's now a sling swivel here, so what am I supposed to do, guys, here? Pretend like I'm trying to drink some tea or something? It's a little awkward to grip around this bad boy, but still doable, still can get my grip definitely tucked up in there. It just feels like I want to drink some tea. Magazine still is flusher than the 86, but still protrudes some, so maybe not a problem. But ergonomics-wise, it's still fairly tiny and light. And the action, oh my god, this was surprising. This is one of the smoothest I have felt by far. It's actually very pleasant. I really wish or hope that all of you get to try it out someday because there is like practically no stickiness to it. There's barely any hump you have to overcome in the beginning to get her to pull back. But it is just like glass. It is so nice. I thoroughly appreciate that. Now, the safety is about the same as like the 95. However, I do kind of wish they had that thumb pad back here for me to kind of cheat with, because now I got to pinch the cocking piece back a little to kind of help put the safety on. It's a little awkward and it's still kind of stiff, so I do kind of miss a little thumb pad back here. But overall, ergonomics wise, it's still pretty decent. And did you want me to handle the Stützen next?
There you go.
Thank you, thank you. Now, not super big differences, but I'll cover a few of them. Hooray, I've got my handguard up top back, so that's pretty nice. I don't have to handle a hot barrel. I can appreciate that. And I've got a lot of swing swivels and stuff going on here, so I can decide how I want to carry this piece, which is kind of nice. It's, you know, important to accessorize on a gun, I guess. I do have my stocking hook back, and I can attach a bayonet, which is nice. I do like to poke things, I suppose. That is kind of cool. And hooray! Flush sights! It's not going to snag on anything or block my vision, so I appreciate that. I still got my thin wrist, and unfortunately I've still got this guy right here, so, you know, still want to have some tea. Some Earl Grey would be nice, thank you. But yeah, the action on this one, I will say, it is about as stiff as the 95. So it's not quite as smooth as the 90, that I do miss. But overall, ergonomics-wise, it's still pretty decent. And hey, they included the thumb pad back here, so I can at least operate that safety a little easier one-handed. But yeah, they're both pretty decent for ergonomics.
Yeah, after hanging out with 50-inch plus long rifles, it's kind of nice to get some of these light guys in the hands. The short rifle and carbine concept really is the way to go in the long run. All right, I guess it's time to talk about shooting these guys. Let me swap you back out.
Sure.
There we go. We'll go in order. We got the 90. They both chamber, just as a reminder, the same cartridge. They're both roughly the same length and roughly the same weight. So there's probably not going to be a huge difference, except in terms of, like you said, whether they're as, you know, a little thicker like that one, or this one's thinned down just a bit like the M95 long rifle. Is there anything that really came up that stood out to you different when you were actually putting rounds down range?
Okay, now for difference, I definitely will say, like I said, the sight on this one is sticking up more. It's like the 86. It's like somewhere between the 89, 90 and like the 86. Like it's still sticking out pretty far. It's not my favorite because it does block some of my vision. Now, actually, will you hand the Stützen over? Thank you. Just look at the difference. Like you can just see how far that's coming out, and you can honestly even just sort of tell like it's going to block some of your vision, which I definitely do appreciate these flush sights. They really do make a difference. Now, as far as the V-notches, like I said, they're still about medium range, so they're not super deep, not super short. So as far as the sight picture goes, it was still okay. So I would probably give this bad boy like about 6 or 7 again, and this one I'd probably stick back up with 8 or 9 just because I've got more of my peripheral vision back with that flush sight. Now, for shooting these guys, like I said, the action on the 90 was much smoother, and it felt so clean shooting at that, and it gave like no problems on range, which was fantastic. Whereas this bad boy, I can't unfortunately really consider it in part of my decision as far as like if I would take into battle in the end or anything, because it did have problems ejecting rounds, but that wasn't its fault. It actually had like a ejector that had been bubbled a little bit, so it wasn't its fault, and I'm not going to consider that as part of my ultimate decision with it. I will say that. But the action, like I said, about the same as the 95, a little sticky, but that's okay. The trigger, exactly the same as the 95, wasn't entirely my favorite, and I could always feel when the break was happening on both of these guys. So just, you know, not my favorite, but I can again work around that since I've shot enough guns at this point. I'm used to that kind of expectation. Now, for the recoil, I will say both of these, not having as much weight or heft to them, the recoil actually was a little bit snappier. It did have a significant snappiness to it. Now, if you shot the 9530s in market, those actually, you know, different cartridge and all, they do have a much more of an oomph to the recoil. However, like, they're much more than these are actually in terms of recoil. Like this one still had a significant amount, but I felt it was still manageable. That 9530s were actually much worse than these were. But yeah, overall shooting wise, for the most part, they performed well. I couldn't fault, like I said, this one for its ejecting process, but overall, they were still pleasant shooters, and the recoil on both was definitely manageable.
Yeah, it wouldn't take a field armorer more than 5 minutes to fix the issue we had with this one. We just didn't get around to noticing it until it was too late to not have to film. Anyway, some things get into rust with this show. But we had already seen the 95 long rifle. You guys know exactly how that gun performs. This is just shorter. So, I guess since we already know how the 95 performed, we probably have an inkling of what your decision is going to be about whether or not you take one or both of these carbines into battle, but that still doesn't get us away from asking the question. So, let's see if we can get these both into your hands. There we go.
I think I can do this.
And why don't you try to give us an answer? Which, either, both, whatever, would you take into the Great War?
All right, so like I said, the triggers weren't super great on these, and the sights on this one weren't flush like I would like them. However, they both performed well. You know, not pointing out, you're not thinking about the ejector on this one too much. Again, that wasn't its fault. But they both did well in range. I performed well with them. All shots were on target, and the actions were smooth. Like, overall, these were decent shooters. I enjoyed them, and I would feel confident taking these into the battles, be it over on a mountain or in a trench. Now, if I had to pick which one to take into battle, like if I was given a choice, I would actually go with the Stützen, just because it gives me that bayonet back that I would appreciate. I do want to be able to poke things. And I've got this handguard that actually prevents me from touching the hot barrel, plus my sights are flush, so I've got all of my sight picture back, which I can appreciate. So overall, yes to both. If I had to pick, I'd go with the Stützen.
Now, just for clarity, she's saying the 95 Stützen, because there was, although very rare, a Stützen form of the 90. As a matter of fact, these would also be converted into the same pattern, so if you're very careful, you can still find something maybe as glassy as this with all those fittings.
Whoa.
Alright, so again, check the updates, see where we're at, and as always, we appreciate your support, love, and viewership.
Later, guys.
Hi guys, Mae here. Things are crazy busy right now, so I'm just here to give a quick little update. Thank you patrons for all of your support, and thank you poster guys. Like, oh my goodness, things are insane right now with that. Record numbers, awesome. But yeah, Othais will give an update later on, so expect that coming soon. So I guess I just get to do my own kind of update right now. I gotta pee. Okay, bye guys.